Wow.
You crazy son of a bitch, you did it!
I admit it, I'd all but given up hope of seeing the ALP step in to sort out this Stage 3 mess. But they've finally gathered up the courage to take a crack at defusing the Stage 3 ticking time bomb left for them by the Coalition. Having been wedged in 2019, Alba has played the ultimate Uno reverse card and now looks likely to return wedge the Coalition. First things first, tweaking the Stage 3 tax cuts had to happen. It was the right call and the government should be commended for finally stepping in and correcting a mistake. And ultimately Labor appear to have struck a fairly decent balance. So let's take a look at the proposed changes to Stage 3 before getting into some of the nitty-gritty. To try and make this as least confusing as possible, I'll refer to the Stage 3 tax cuts that were voted on by Parliament in 2019 and legislated as the Coalition version, and the proposed Stage 3 amendments as the Labor version. The second thing to say is that the Labor version's not locked in yet, it still needs to pass Parliament. But given what it's going to do, I'd be surprised if it doesn't. In a nutshell, the proposed changes to Stage 3 involve bringing back the 37% tax bracket that was abolished under the Coalition version, and it'll kick in at a higher point than the current 37% bracket. They'll also lower the tax rate for the bottom tax bracket from 19% to 16%, and lower the threshold for the top tax rate from $200,000 under the Coalition version to $190,000 under Labor's version. You guys remember Barry? He's our median income earner from the last video. Let's take a look at what the proposed Stage 3 changes would mean for him compared to what he currently pays tax-wise, and what he would pay if the Coalition version of Stage 3 were to kick in. I went through the details of the first two scenarios in the last video, so I won't repeat that. But to summarise, based on the current tax rate, Barry pays $12,437 in tax per year, and under the Coalition's version, he'd stand to pay $11,872 per year. So let's look at Labor's proposed Stage 3 changes. Under Labor's proposal, Barry will still pay no tax on his first $18,200, but now he'll pay 16% tax on his next $26,800, and he'll still pay 30% tax on his final $22,600. All up, under Labor's proposed Stage 3 tax cuts, Barry will pay $11,068 a year in tax, which is a saving of $1,369 a year, compared to what he'd be paying now, or a saving of just over $26 a week. Pretty handy. So it's a fairly decent improvement over Barry's current situation, as well as what he would have received under the Coalition's version of Stage 3. I guess the question is, so will people be better off? And this is where word games start to come in. Technically, under Labor's proposed changes, everyone earning more than $18,200 a year will pay less tax than they would under the current tax rate, that is the tax rates today. So yeah, one side can technically say everyone paying tax will get a tax cut under Labor's proposal. On the other hand, the Coalition's Stage 3 plan had already been legislated. As a result of that, as well as Labor's constant recommitment to them, there are people earning around $150,000 per year or more that will now receive less than what they would have reasonably expected to come the start of the next financial year. So yes, technically the other side can say that some people will be worse off compared to what they'd expected, although you'll have a hard time drumming up much sympathy for what most average people would consider high income earners.
Just a quick little side note.
When you receive a tax cut, it doesn't mean that you'll get a lump sum.
When do I get the money?
Explain.
It means a little bit less tax will be taken out of your pay each pay period. So in Barry's case, he won't get a $1,369 lump sum payment. He'll instead just see $26 or so less coming out of his pay each week. Whilst the government should be commended for ultimately making the right call, they'll also be rightly criticised for breaking a promise they took to the election. It's a promise that they've made over and over again in the last couple of years.
We support them. People are entitled to have that certainty of the tax cuts that have been legislated, and we won't be changing them.
Our position hasn't changed. It's very clear. These are due to come in 2024. We haven't changed our position on the Stage 3 tax cuts.
Can you promise to those Australian families the Stage 3 tax cuts will come into effect in July in full?
Well, we haven't changed our position on that, Michael.
The government's position hasn't changed. We have no change to our plans. Tax cuts will happen in July.
And a promise they were apparently still committed to less than a week ago.
We haven't changed our position.
So what changed in a week? It's not like cost of living just became a problem overnight. In case I'm not clear, I don't have a problem with the tweaking of the tax cuts or this broken promise if that's how you want to look at it. But I do have a bit of a problem with the fact that Labor made the promise in the first place and then continued to reconfirm their commitment to it all the way up to a couple of days before they flip-flopped. And to me, the media aren't asking the right questions. The questions shouldn't be around the broken promise, but about why Labor waited until now to make the call. And why did they make the promise heading into the last election in the first place? There'll be all sorts of reasons rolled out to defend the broken promise, but I'd take them more with a grain of salt because they really don't stand up to much scrutiny. The Treasurer is correct in saying that the Coalition's Stage 3 tax cuts were designed 5 years ago, before the pandemic, the global inflation spikes and interest rate rises. That's all correct. But that also ignores the fact that Labor further committed to delivering Stage 3 in full as an election promise in 2022, and have recommitted to the delivery constantly and consistently up until around a week ago. Yeah, the pandemic happened, but that started in 2020. The economic impacts were well known by the time Labor were making election promises. Yes, global inflation spiked, but global inflation spiked in 2022 after surging in 2021, before election promises. And yes, interest rates have risen, but again, that started prior to the election. And yes, global uncertainty is a thing, but when isn't it really? Regardless, Russia's invasion of Ukraine began in early 2022, ahead of the election. You see the point? The reasons for tweaking the Stage 3 tax cuts have always existed. They haven't just sprung up in January 2024. And Labor argued against Stage 3 back in 2019. And they continued even after they'd begrudgingly supported them.
Stage 3 is the least responsible, least affordable, least fair.
That is until they got close to the 2022 election. That's when they did their 180. Now, the cynic in me still thinks Labor's Stage 3 promise was more about making sure they were as small a target as possible and didn't give the Coalition anything to attack them on. I mean, what's wrong with being transparent with voters? Why not just put forward tweaks to the Stage 3 tax cuts to voters ahead of the 2022 election? Giving more tax cuts to more people, it should have been an easy sell. Even if they didn't want to put forward an alternative, why make a commitment that they weren't going to keep? Any questions on Stage 3 could have been batted away with something like, they're legislated to kick in 2024, they were designed in 2019, a lot's changed since then, we'll review them closer to 2024 to make sure they make financial sense in the economic climate of the day. As much as sections of Twitter may like to take issue with Lisa Miller, and as much as I don't like her tone here, you can't deny that her point here is a valid one.
Well, you've delivered the opposition their advertising campaign for the next election, lay down misère.
In promising to deliver something they knew was a bad idea and then continuing to commit to it, as recently as a few days ago, Labor have opened themselves up to that accusation. They have gift-wrapped the attack ads for the next election. They may have originally committed to Stage 3 to stay a small target in 2022, but in going back on their commitment, they've certainly made a bigger target for themselves in the future. Yeah, the Prime Minister broke an election promise, but let's be honest, he's not the first PM to have done that, and he's not going to be the last. In the grand scheme of broken political promises, this was one worth breaking. I don't have an issue with that. What I do have an issue with is the fact that the promise was made in the first place. When it comes to all the broken promise talk by the media and the pearl clutching from the opposition, I find it all a bit hard to take. And I'm not sure how many Australians have that short a memory and can't recall how the Coalition behaved when they were in government. These tweaks aren't perfect, but they are better than what we'd have had the government sat back and done nothing. All this aside, Australia could probably do with a fairly radical tax overhaul, but I just don't think anyone's got the appetite for that right now. The new proposed Stage 3 tax cuts are said to save the budget around $28 billion over 10 years, which sounds like a lot, but given how much the cost of the Coalition's version of Stage 3 has blown out over the years, you'll have to excuse me if I don't take that with a grain of salt. What do I mean? In 2019, Stage 3 were costed at $95 billion. By May 2023, they were costed at $313 billion. By January 2024, that figure had crept up again to over $323 billion. It was an increase of $10.5 billion in less than 12 months. So yeah, I'm not betting the farm on the $28 billion savings over 10 years figure. How the Coalition play this from here is going to be interesting because they're going to have a hard time pitching themselves as the party for the working class.
And we are the parties of the Australian working class.
While at the same time arguing against giving more of those working class a tax cut.
If you win the next election, will you roll back whatever changes are made?
Well, this is our position. This is absolutely our position.
So would you make the changes again? Would you roll them back if you win the next election?
We've made it very clear that this is our policy. The policy is the legislated position that stands today.
What's their argument going to be? Will they roll back Labor's tax cuts and take from the working class to give more to the high income end of town? There have been some murmurings from the Greens on pushing back on this one, but they'd have to have rocks in their head if they kicked up too much of a stink. There are reports they'll push for a further increase of the tax-free threshold, but like a lot of what the Greens push for, while it may be a worthy goal, I just can't see it having any legs. And without costings, I just don't see it going anywhere at all. The one avenue they could take potentially is to push for the government to repurpose the supposed $28 billion saving and push the tax-free threshold up to a point where that $28 billion can subsidise it. That way they and the government can claim that it's a budget-neutral change compared to the coalition's legislated changes. If they're smart though, they'll support the changes, then sit back and let Labor and the coalition take skin off one another. Remember, sometimes two things can be true at once. Yes, tweaking the Stage 3 tax cuts was the right call. And yes, Labor has broken an election promise. I'm guessing though that Labor has done enough polling for them to know that their Stage 3 promise was a promise that the majority of the country are all too happy for them to break.